we are officially on. I will just post the YouTube link via the chat so you can share and send to other people as well. Just a minute.
Good, yeah, let me open the chat here as well so I know what's going on. So Jefferson, are we live? Are we good to go?
Yeah, we're live now.
Yes, excellent.
That's
Monica,
the
are you
link
back
of the
as
YouTube,
well?
so you can share.
All right, thank you. Good. Well, welcome everybody. I would first like to welcome our panelists who are here, and it's I think you made it for the face mask as well. We are here. Some of us are here in Brazil at Sao Paulo's at University of Sao Paulo at the SciBiz conference, and Sao Paulo, at University of Sao Paulo in particular, still has some very strict COVID rules where we have to wear face masks. I know in some of the locations where you are, this is already a little bit more relaxed. But I welcome our panelists on this panel here at SciBiz on global innovation. We have 4 panelists altogether. If you include me as well, I've been asked to chair and moderate this panel. Let me just very quickly introduce you to the panel and the panelists. Now, why is it called GLORAD panel? It is because the University of Sao Paulo is one of the hosts of GLORAD. GLORAD is a research center for global R&D and innovation. And in fact, one of the organizer, Professor Moacir Miranda Oliveira, is a member of GLORAD, and he has asked us to host this panel on global R&D innovation. Briefly on GLORAD, it's a research network, a research center with multiple teams in different locations. It started back in 2003 as a cooperation between Tsinghua University and University of St. Gallen. But it has expanded, and in 2016, University of Sao Paulo joined our network, and Professor Moacir, who is the founder of SciBiz Conference, joined also our network with a team from the University of Sao Paulo. Now, I'm happy to say that on this panel we have also Monika Petraite, who is a professor at KTU in Lithuania, and she and her team expanded our network in 2015, so just 1 year before I was here. And also Iris Chuen, who is a professor at San Jose State University, and actually she expanded our network in 2014. Unfortunately, this was the earliest edition since, away from China, but I'm happy to have all 2 of you from GLORAD on board. And then there's also obviously Professor Mette Pras Knudsen, who is from the University of Southern Denmark. She is technically speaking not hosting a GLORAD team, but she's a long-term collaborator. We've been working together many different projects in the GLORAD context, sometimes and sometimes outside. Anyway, GLORAD is happy to host this panel, and thank you, Moacir, for inviting us to do that. Now, who are the panelists? And I briefly introduced them already, so I'm not going to say much more about them, other than introducing the topic of the panel. Here are some of the areas of the research areas that these professors are working on. But they will introduce themselves when I'm handing over the microphone to them. Personally, I will not say much in the beginning, other than saying that global innovation is certainly a topic which has grown in importance and significance over the last 10, 15, 20 years, to the extent, in fact, that it is now in everyone's thought, and especially if you're in industry, it is a common denominator for many decisions that people are making, even if they are making local or only country-based decisions, because it is no longer just a heyday, sort of a topic of what happens in a faraway country. On the other hand, and this is the topic of what I will speak about, is about the great decoupling, which is also going to affect the businesses going forward from 2021, 2022 forward, which has probably started a little bit earlier, but has really become mainstream only in the last couple of years. And the question is, how is this going to affect us? So how are we going to run this panel? Each one of the panelists will have about 5 minutes or so to make a statement, make a point that they would like to talk about. There will be no questions at that point, but if you do have questions from the audience, please put them into the chat window, or at least announce that you have a question so that we can keep track of you and turn the microphone over to you at the point when we enter the Q&A. So after these introductions, I will then raise a few questions with each one of the panelists just to get the interaction going and the questions going. And at that point, we'll pick also on questions from the audience. We have a bit over an hour in total. And we'd like to make this as interactive as possible after the introductory statements. Now, allow me to give you some background on global innovation in the big picture. And this will only take 2 or 3 minutes myself before I will then hand over to Monica Petraite. So this great decoupling that we are talking about, and we've been talking about perhaps mostly in the context of China, really is something that goes back much, much longer. It is certainly going back ever since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. But before that, we had different types of decouplings. Now we had sort of the great struggles at the time of the 1960s and 70s that were mostly affecting technology struggles, technology standards, such as Betamax or VHS, or maybe in the 1990s, the browser wars. These were different technologies that were competing over customers in the same markets. I think what is happening now is a bit different. What happens is that we are pretty much having the same technologies for most of these products, but we have delineating markets more forcefully along geographical boundaries or even continental boundaries. And China has been a protagonist of that in many ways because of the fact that many of the foreign companies that would like to be in China cannot be in China, and pretty much has ruled it impossible for Google or Yahoo or YouTube and Facebook to operate in China in order, and this is a fair enough ambition, fair enough to protect the emerging local industries and local startups to develop a certain size and a certain competence before they're just being bought up by foreign companies. But in the meantime, this has turned into a international phenomenon or a form of international significance, where Chinese companies mostly work with Chinese markets but also Chinese developed technology, often coming from the technologies originally invented by other companies. So there's perhaps a trend or a switch in these underlying mechanisms of decoupling happening. It's very often the same technologies, but now, in fact, the same markets. And I can illustrate this with this example here, where WeChat and WhatsApp, which are two originally very similar applications based on pretty much the same technology, over time, because of the delineation of access to markets in China, developed initially from WeChat copying from WhatsApp, where you can see some of the features that were introduced by WhatsApp, for instance, text messaging or media transfer in 2009, were copied by WeChat in 2011 and 2012 after WeChat was launched. But over time, WeChat became increasingly innovative and started to innovate new features that WhatsApp started to copy. And this is only possible because these technologies have been are actually fairly similar, if not even identical. But the markets are separate because on the one hand, you have a market in China, and on the other, you have mostly a market outside China. WhatsApp is used outside China. It's actually not possible to use it in China. WeChat is possible to use outside China, but it's mostly only used by Chinese or perhaps by individuals who have traveled to China. So that is just to illustrate one aspect of this global decoupling that also affects innovation. Now, to trigger some discussion points for later, my question I would like to throw out into the audience and into the room here, perhaps also for the panelists, is what is going to happen in the future? Is this just a one-time occurrence that China is sort of the exception, or is this something that will happen with other countries as well? So can we ignore what's happening here and just carry on as usual and say, okay, fine, we continue to do investment in innovation R&D in China, and we'll just operate as if nothing is happening? You know, there are companies in China that have no market access, but still do R&D there. Or do we see maybe a sort of a leveling out of the global innovation efforts in the sense that we just maintain what we have, but we're not really going to invest much more in international R&D because of this decoupling? It's going to be more difficult to access these markets, and the technology is the same anyhow. Or perhaps, and this is the more pessimistic notion of it, are we going to see a reversal of the global R&D investments? Something that we are seeing, for instance, with respect to global supply chains and global value chains, where they're actually retrenching and nearshoring and coming closer rather than supporting or extending or continuing their global supply chain efforts. Or maybe something halfway in between, where we say, okay, global, that used to be, and now we're more of a regionalization or continentalization, where markets, if they're big enough, they will support their own global R&D investments in global R&D networks, somewhat similar to the in China for China, in India for India paradigm. So certainly a few important questions that will be interesting to discuss in the light of recent events and recent trends. Many of those that are politically or geopolitically motivated, but clearly spill over into strategy making in multinational companies, where to locate innovation, how to source innovation in different places, how to organize their own businesses and business processes around it. So that was just one statement I wanted to drop into the audience and as a starting point for the panel. And as I said earlier, I'm handing over now to Professor Petraite, Monika Petraite at KTU, and later to Professor Meretras-Knudsen, and last but not least to Professor Ais Chen in California. But first, Monika, I'm handing over to you.
Thank you so much. So may I request you to stop screen sharing so I can upload my presentation. I did exactly for you, I guess. 1 second. So I will start sharing my screen now. Can you see my screen? Yeah, excellent. So thank you, Max, for this kind introduction. It seems that we have a small community meeting there, but I believe that nevertheless, this discussion is very important, and I'm happy to start this research about the challenges I believe global innovation is facing from the very hot place of the world today, apparently. So I will tell what kind of challenges we are facing, but basically what I will talk is about continuous innovation management in R&D intensive firms that come from European peripheries, and particularly Lithuania, and how those countries in general manage the innovation and let's say so organize the innovation work, and how they create their successes without China and without many other countries. Nevertheless, they are global hidden champions. So very briefly about the context, what we call Lithuanian periphery, and so in a way, what we see that European periphery are the countries that are moderate innovators. So it's older east border of Europe, a part of Scandinavia. As we go down, we can see that actually all the countries are moderate innovators, according to European Innovation Scoreboard 2021. And this is something that also associated to Eastern, Central Eastern European countries, but we can see that only few of them are managing, like Estonia, which is like a strong innovator, not innovator, leader, and then Lithuania is somewhere in moderate innovator group, catching up, not a laggard, but then we have Latvia in between, so the small Baltic countries that are around. But of course, the ultimate purpose of innovation is to grow in value chains and to assure industrial learning across the region, which is one of the most innovative and competitive regions, not only in Europe, but also in the world, the Nordic region, right? So this is very important for us, especially, and we need to understand how we can plug in into global networks and to succeed in them, especially as of today, as Politico has announced a fantastic in the brackets announcement that Lithuania is the most dangerous place in the world, and which actually restricted people of travel. So because of the Ukrainian-Russian war. But what does it mean for, and of course we have very active military movements around the country, but the thing is that this has disrupted completely value chains, supply chains, knowledge flows that naturally would be in the region. So like eastwards, nothing is happening. Lithuania also is a very interesting country because of its support to Taiwan. It has disrupted completely its relationship with China. Any kind of relationship, no business, no trade, no, of course, scholar or students exchange happening. So in a way, it's a small country that, and the firms in that small country that have to figure out their way without the global, without some of the global innovation networks. And so how do they do, and how those firms manage, and how do they succeed to grow? And what I'm presenting, by the way, Max, how many minutes I have? I can talk for hours. It's my lifetime research.
We were thinking about 5 minutes in total, but we're not really going to count the clock.
5 minutes. Okay, so I'll be quick. Okay, so what we did, we raised the question with that rationale. We wanted to understand how those countries can succeed, because it seems there are no good prerequisites of success apart of being in a very strong industrial innovative region of the north of Europe and across the Baltic country. So we looked, we wanted to look at a particular group of companies that we consider as high growth innovative enterprises that demonstrated very long-term growth over decades and crises, like the financial crisis of 2008, and then they didn't stop at COVID. And now we have this new crisis where businesses say that the COVID businesses remember as a pink dream compared to what's happening today because of this war conflict in all areas, and they have to innovate constantly. So we wanted to understand what leads businesses to success, because those are small companies. They can be classified as hidden champions. They are well embedded in global networks and learning fast. So we looked at those companies explicitly, and so I will skip the definitions. It can be read. But we thought of those companies that are very well plugged in, tuned into the global networks of innovation, and how they are configuring their micro foundations in order to achieve better results and in order to achieve long-term growth. And what we wanted, we actually were coming back to the same companies over years, and we had 2 to 3 interviews with each of the firm, and we have, of course, the transcripts, and we made it a long qualitative study. And so what we found that actually there were some very important critical factors that were embedded in the success of woven into the success of the firm while looking at firm's profile, strategic design, and ecosystem networking and stakeholders. And this is the list of the firms from high-tech sectors, various sectors we took that were important also in our country. And we have figured out that firms actually went through some important changes or development stages, which we called more like an inception. Young firm, which mainly focuses on market expansion and network strategies, were set at the very beginning. And then they move into some kind of interim development where not only markets and consumers matter, but actually venture capital investment shapes quite heavily and pushes firms out of their let's say so orbita of navigation, and actually forces them to globalize very quickly. And then because we looked at the success stories, not a forensic study, so we see that while maturing, they start shaping their own ecosystems that are by design already global and well internationally networked in innovation and R&D networks. So then, long story short, we had to look at what are those micro foundations that leads firms to succeed in those networks, while also understanding the political situation is very vulnerable always, while being a small firm, small medium-sized firm from a small country on the edge of Europe and European Union, Schengen's border. So we found that actually those who were successful, as simple as that, but not so easy to explain, was those firms that were able to make decisions and actually transform organizations faster than the others. So we extracted that variable using grounded theory approach as rapid decision making, or we also are looking now at the dynamic decision making theory. And we understood that being faster than your peers in the industry defines your long-term success and actually allows you to make better innovation decisions. But what leads to that speed of decision making? These are 2 things. First of all, firms' transformational learning that is based on the network, international networks and ecosystem that firm has shaped. So actually learning, connectivity-based learning, or learning from your connections, from your networks, is critical for that variable, that single variable of decision-making speed. And of course, making right decisions, not only fast, but also good decisions, is the defining factor. So in a way, the strength of your network defines the strength of your micro foundations for long-term innovation success. And that leads in that composed variable that, of course, we can talk dynamic capabilities, many other things, but to the faster decision-making and right decision-making. And then the second variable that, of course, was very important, how do you stay tuned in the network and how do you have a maximum access to the flows of knowledge and innovation in the network? And we found the variable of responsibility and responsible innovation behavior. So that, first of all, ethical, responsive, adaptive innovation behavior as based to your network values. So being in a network and being ethical in a network forms the ground for constant flow of innovation. And so those were the basically critical findings of our long research. We are still working on that, but I think my time is up. Is that correct, Max? I think this is the critical finding, that even in being small and from a small country, you can actually build up very strong innovation position in global R&D networks via network embeddedness and applying transformational learning and developing dynamic capabilities that lead to decision making. So decisions has to be made. This is also critically important as a capability of the firm in rapidly changing innovation environments. So this is basically the main conclusions, and further studies would focus more on this network influences and co-influences and compound variables in order to understand how we actually can train this particular skill of innovation decision making and make the pivoting faster. So thank you for having that floor, and any questions, I believe they will come later, right? Is that correct? Or we'll go with the discussion.
Yes, that's correct. We will have the Q&A after every one of the panelists had a chance to present their thoughts. Okay. Thank you, Monica. Great. Thank you. No, I'm familiar with your research and I find it super exciting. Thanks a lot. Mede, if I may ask you to share your thoughts with us.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me also just share my slides. So, thank you very much for inviting me to the panel, Max, and to the organizers for this interesting conference. I was thinking a little bit about how to approach these few minutes I have in terms of global innovation. And I took inspiration from the views from global innovation experts and thought I would offer a perspective on the secrets of the Nordic innovation champions. I have done quite a lot of research on commercialization of technologies, market creation, and open innovation. But in this presentation, I will draw on some of my experiences as an expert to the European Commission on innovation policy. So, and in fact, thank you to Monica, because I will link to some of the thoughts that you also just presented in terms of using the European scoreboard. So this is the findings from the 2020 scoreboard, and you will see that among the innovation leaders, you have Denmark and Sweden together with Finland, for instance. So we have the Nordic innovation champions. And when you look across the countries, you will see that Brazil is would be among the moderate innovators. There is progress, and Brazil is moving up in the scoreboard. There's a special section that describes Brazilian industry, and I thought it would be interesting to look at what learnings may Brazil take from some of the challenges and opportunities from Denmark and Sweden. So if we look at the case of Denmark, and I will not go through all these numbers, but just give you the highlights. You will see that Denmark has a really strong performance in terms of its research system. So we have very good performance in terms of new doctorate graduates. We have very good performance in terms of publications and co-pilot publications and so on. We have a very good performance on human resources, which basically speaks to education. And we have a very innovation-friendly environment, meaning the framework that the government offers for companies and universities to innovate. On the downside, or the concerns that we have with respect to Danish performance, it would be that we have problems with the innovators, meaning the share of firms that are innovating over a 3-year period is not very well, and is in fact decreasing in the comparison between 2012 and 2019, so up until pre-COVID. We also see that we have relatively few SMEs that innovate in-house, and this has especially an impact on the sales from new products. So while we have a very good, what we would say, an input side, so there's a strong knowledge production, on the other hand side, there seems to be some issues with the company's performance. Now, one thing that I would like to put forward here is that the Nordic countries are, and Monica also mentioned this, they're not very big economies, but they're also very open economies. And there is a strong sense of trust. And there's also a strong degree of autonomy and freedom. Now, this is a finding from a research study that was published on companies. And I would like to take insights from that. So what you see here is on the y-axis, the probability of firms innovating, so small and medium-sized firms innovating. And on the other axis, you have a response scale where we asked about you can say the organizational creative climate. So here we look at what are the resources that they invest, how are their strategy, is it a risk-willing strategy, what are the risk responses, and how much do they allow for idea time, and then finally freedom or autonomy. And what you will take from this slide is that by one increase in freedom or autonomy, the likelihood of a firm innovating actually decreases by 60%. So we will see that the more autonomy you give, the less likely it is that firms will be innovative. And this links quite well with the culture of the Nordic countries. So you can say we have two paradoxes, one for Denmark, where we have a very weak conversion of the strong knowledge base that I showed you before, and a conversion into new products on the market. So while we have strong knowledge, we have a strong educational system, we have a high degree of or high share of the population being educated, we have also too much autonomy, it seems, and we would need more focus. So one insight or the paradox here would be that to get the knowledge from the cities to the peripheral regions and into the firms so that they can innovate better. If we take the Swedish case, and I haven't given you the details due to the time, but there we see a slightly different challenge, namely that they have a very bipolar system. There's a very deep gap between research on one hand side and innovation in firms on the other hand side. So this gap is both between the public university system and firms, and the fact that they have very large but very few multinationals that have a very high R&D performance, and all other firms, not all other firms, but as an illustration. So there, the need would be to stimulate collaboration to bridge the gaps between these in these two respects. So finally, yes, they are innovation champions, as we've seen with the scoreboard, but there are also some hidden cracks. So one thing is that, and what they have in common is that there are these commercialization challenges. So converting the strong input from the research system into products on the market is something that is challenging, and we've seen that over the years. We also see that the SMEs are insufficiently involved and do not demand the available knowledge. They think they are strong enough as is. And then finally, we see this division of knowledge creation and knowledge use. So should be a focus on how to enhance the demand and utilization of the knowledge. So you can say across these two countries, what we should maybe focus on but also learn from is to have policies that focus more on spreading and sharing knowledge rather than creating new knowledge. And we should have a new challenge, you can say, that will be in front of us, and that would be to innovate for sustainability and climate change. So there is, again, a tendency in policy to focus on building more knowledge to create new industrial strengths. But again, that will just only further the paradoxes as I've highlighted. So what does this mean if I would say something about Brazil? Well, I know there's a strong focus on the educational system and creating new knowledge, but I think learning here is to be sure to have this connect between science and business. And I think this is why this event is so super important. And I hope that we can have also a good discussion on how to stimulate these links, because this is not only something we see in strong innovating countries, we also see that in other countries. Thank you very much for the word.
Thank you very much, Medivh. Again, really interesting insights here. I think we spend too little time in the Nordics to understand what's going on. For us, this is always so far away and perhaps somewhat insulated, isolated from the main centers of where we believe innovation is taking place. It's really good to hear how advanced the state of affairs in innovation, in fact, is apparently leading. So maybe come visit more frequently and learn from the Nordics. So thank you, Medivh. I will now hand over to Iris, who is joining us from yet another continent. In fact, we are on 3 different continents this time. Iris, I do not see you right now on the list of attendees, probably because you are bumped down all the way to the right-hand side. Are you here? Can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear? Can you see me?
Perfect. Thank you, Iris.
Can you see me?
Yes.
All right. Okay, thank you, Max. Yeah, really glad to be here, and thank you, Monica. Thank you, Matt, for your sharing your thoughts. That's really fascinating. So I'm here I'm not going to go into details on any of my specific research. So I'm going to just share, what I've been doing, my research interests, and a bit of understanding of deglobalization that, Max raised a very interesting question there. So a little bit about my own research timeline. So from early on, maybe let's say almost 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. So I started to get interested in globalization of innovation, or R&D at the time. So I started on my PhD research on multinational corporations, R&D labs in China. So where I did some extensive field work there. To talk to many R&D labs at the time. And at the time, what fascinated me was, why? Because China, we know that has a weak IP protection law, and why, a lot of multinational companies go to China and without the fear of losing their intellectual property. So one of the interesting findings at the time was that I did identify this, what we call the hierarchical segmentation of R&D process for multinational corporations. So basically, if you look at how they organize the R&D work, it's the most value-added part is done in advanced countries, while they put the less value-added in more developing countries, like China, Brazil, India, or other developing countries. So that time still, if you look at early 2000s, of course, starting from 1990s, that was still the trend of a lot of, multinational corporations from developed countries and moving their innovation R&D labs into the developing countries. But then starting, after 2010, and we see, especially represented by China, we see a lot of, multinational corporations from within developing countries like China. They started to look abroad and look at, how we are going to utilize the global R&D resources and to have our innovation globally, placing in other developed countries. So that's that prompted my, the second line of research. I'm looking at the international R&D strategies of Chinese companies in Europe and America. So there, also through some case studies, some in-depth, field research. So looking at, how Chinese companies going to Europe actually are different from Chinese companies going to the US, in terms of their R&D strategies. So that is, just basically going along the trend that Max described very earlier. So that's really interesting. And then so at the time, I also examined some, at the policy level. So for instance, I did a cross-national, policy study looking at the photovoltaics, like the solar panel industry, and comparing the cases of US, Germany, and China. So looking at, how the national policies are different to help, with innovation in this industry. And specifically, there was a technology push from the US or a demand pull from the Germany side. And in China, it's more like a manufacturing push policies. So that's, I find interesting to understand the landscape. So that's on the briefly on global innovation, how I look at it. And then meanwhile I also pay attention to how local context play the important factor in innovation. Okay, so I did do a case study on BYD. That is a BYD, this short for Build Your Dream. That's a electric car company that's pretty much, well known these days. If you are, you pay attention to the auto industry and how, the electric cars has played in a role, especially, in China, it's really the #1 player. And they have also marched into the international market. And in the US, actually, you see that there are a lot of electric buses. So that provided by BYD. And BYD, that was also, they were named as a top 10 most innovative companies in the world by Forbes. And they are ahead of Ford, General Motors. So in terms of innovation in auto manufacturing development. And then, so I was investigating on, how the local context in China, within China, that played a role for BYD's innovation. So that is, another research I did, but I'm not going to go a lot more in depth here. So going to Max's early question, so the deglobalization of innovation, it's very interesting a new phenomenon we're looking at, right? And I do see both forces, the forces pulling in both directions. On the one hand, we do see, like because of digitization, it made a lot of like module processes much easier to be transferred across national borders. So in that case, you see companies, they have more tools or more assets, technology assets that they can use to be globalized. So that is still a globalization factor. But on the other hand, there are deglobalization forces. For instance, so this, we all know the recent crisis of the semiconductor supply chain problem, right? So that prompted a lot of nations, basically, they're saying, okay, we have to protect, those industries with national security, right? Strategic importance, those kind of sectors. So that really kind of pulled, the globalization of the forces away. So it's more like deglobalization forces there. And another example, if you look at the healthcare, health data, for instance, regulations. So a lot of countries really making it hard, to have these data to go cross borders. So data is very important, and especially for this digital economy. So it makes the innovation hard cross borders in that sense. So I do see, both forces, and lastly, I want to show that, I do have a chart here. I actually found from The Economist magazine. I think it's very interesting. So it's looking at, the number of unicorns. Okay, so because we talk about globalization, on the one hand, it's the big multinational corporations, and on the other hand, it's the small startups, right? And that is, unicorns, where we put companies evaluated at over $1 billion. So you can see this one. Let me just quickly share a screen for this one chart. Yeah, if you can see this chart here, and this is looking at by years, so 2011, 2016, 2021. And you're looking at here, well, on the one hand, there seems to be a globalization trend, but on the other hand, if you look at more recent 2021, San Francisco is way, way ahead of all other, innovative cities now. So it's still followed by Beijing, and then London, Bengaluru, Paris, Berlin, Singapore, Tel Aviv, Sao Paulo is pretty high up there, and Amsterdam. So yeah, you can see go down the list. And when 2011, so there weren't that many unicorns, and you can see that it's more like even. Okay, but then going above to 2016, and San Francisco had over 30 and lead, but then the gap is bigger in 2021. So that's just I like show you how interesting it is. If you look at unicorns and look at how innovation, on the one hand we do see globalization, it's a multi-innovative centers, innovation centers across the globe, but on the other hand it's getting also polarized, and in the sense that maybe partly due to the deglobalization forces, but we do see San Francisco is having a much bigger lead at this stage. But anyways, I just stop here. Yeah, so we'll thank you. I guess there will be some questions later.
Thank you very much, Iris. We've had at least 3 interesting and diverse perspectives that we heard. So I really appreciate that. I will ask a couple of questions, but I would like to encourage the audience, which is distributed both over the Zoom call here and at the YouTube channel, to dial in and post some questions if they have into the chat, or just get ready for raising those questions with us directly. One question I have for Monica, just to kick off the discussion, and obviously, yes, panelists, please, everybody, you can also raise questions. I didn't want to mute you in that, at all. But Monica, your work on small companies, and obviously this is perhaps initially mostly around Eastern European small companies such as Lithuania. But what you're saying here is that maybe something that large countries could learn from small countries as well, right? Small countries obviously are a bit in a position where they really have to succeed because they don't have the same depth of resources or the same alternatives that larger countries can resort to. So what is it that small countries do that make them better at innovating than large countries? And how could large countries perhaps learn here from small countries? How could maybe large firms even learn from what companies do in smaller countries, or what small countries do in general?
Thank you very much for the observation and for the question, Max. I think it opens very broad lines of discussion because, first of all, like what our research shows, that innovation is not a country level phenomena. And this was also confirmed by Iris and also by Mete's presentation. So it's much more, if we want to understand innovation dynamics, we should rather look at regions, learning regions and innovative regions. And large countries, first of all, I think they have peripheries as well. And there is a city like Sao Paulo, what Iris has shown, and there is entire Brazil that is completely different, right? So in a way, larger countries, of course, the unit of analysis is very misleading, especially as we talk about innovation policies and development of national innovation systems, because if you look at the general data, for the small country, they are pretty much correct, but for the large country, it could be completely misleading. So I think peripheries exist everywhere. They are where, like megapolis or large cities, they can be self-sustainable innovation ecosystems and very innovative cities. Well, not to mention Shanghai, or it's not even San Francisco, it's the entirety of Silicon Valley, right? We should look at a little bit broader how it expands to North California, let's say so. But so coming back to that, I think that, and then another dimension, that there are everywhere peripheries exist, and also even though large companies are very appealing for both researchers and also let's say so policymakers or macroeconomists, because they contribute largely to employment, GDP, innovation, speed, and dynamic, you name it. The economies by far everywhere are dominated by small companies, small, medium-sized companies. So this is how the employment is created. This is how the wealth is created. This is how actually the income is created for the majority of the society, regardless of how large one company could be. So basing on that, I could say that the study of periphery and small, medium-sized companies is very relevant to every country, would it be large or small. So this is important, and also for even for large companies, they can pick up, because I think our findings are critically important, because we find that long-term success is about embeddedness in the varieties of international networks, and actually putting the transformational learning processes first are critically important in order to speed the decision making. And I think the larger company goes, of course, there is entire theory of organizational bureaucracies and rigidities and organizational rigidities while dealing with technological discontinuities is critical challenge for the changing companies. And what just Matthew raised in her presentation, that more and more technologies are orienting towards sustainability solutions and aiming at solving sustainable challenges. That means that many technologies as we know them today will be discontinued and replaced with novel solutions. So dealing with technological discontinuities requires again, embeddedness, connectivity-based learning, and actually your networks also have to change in order to get access to this, let's say, so distant knowledge from the traditional technological learning trajectories, and embedding more stakeholders, different groups of societies, even different countries. And then this so-called responsible innovation mantra, I couldn't call it theory or something, but it's a paradigm, or is it a mantra? We will see it later. But then it becomes critically important really to align your steps or to adjust or calibrate your innovation development efforts not only within your ecosystem, but also with the broader networks of influence. So again, this brings back that being small, you always are much more adaptive, and you always seek to adjust and to make many decisions in a very high frequency in order to adjust to the changing. While large companies, I think they face that challenge of being big and kind of shaping their own ecosystem. But then there is a huge risk of missing out those weak signals that come from the networks, and especially from the distant networks, because, like, you know, we have our routines, we have our networks, we learn, but then those are very weak signals, and this is how disruptors come, and technological disruptors come. They usually come from the small unknown places, unknown startups and so on, and then they grow and they change the entirety of technological trajectories, and actually they are responsible for those discontinuities. So I think the learnings are for everyone here. So frankly speaking, thank you.
Thank you, Monica. So panelists, you're obviously perfectly invited also to respond or comment on each other's presentations or statements here as well. Thank you, Monica, for this as well. I think I wanted to take a cue of what you just ended with, which was the learning aspect, because I think this is partially what Mette was talking about. If I were to summarize what you said, at least for me, one of the main takeaways was more transfer, right? Less creation, perhaps. It seems as if we may have innovated enough. Is that an adequate summary, or how do we balance the investment that we continue to make in our R&D innovation capabilities? Should it really be more development, or should it be more transfer?
Yeah, so I think that one observation that is important when we discuss these issues is that most economies have by far small and maybe medium-sized companies, and most of these size companies, they don't really demand knowledge. They think that they have enough as it is, and they get by in the way they can. And we know, so it's sort of a stylized fact that large companies are by definition more innovative than small companies. So I think much of the demand for transfer needs to come from these companies, and that somehow requires that their skill levels increase. So right now, I would say many of them are maybe capable of learning from the available knowledge, but they are not very willing to learn from it. And therefore, we see this decrease. We've seen a decrease since the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, where the small and medium-sized firms are, over the years, less and less innovative. So, and we also know that the likelihood of a firm coming from a position of being non-innovative to innovative is actually very, very small. So I think there is a sense of urgency actually in the transfer. I don't just think it's a matter of we have enough knowledge, but I really think there is an urgency in pointing the interest to the firms in demanding more knowledge that they can convert into innovation. So, and I would expect that the COVID pandemic will even further accentuate this need, because the learnings from these kind of crises is that most companies will actually stall their innovation activities. So in that sense, I think there is an urgency in convincing or finding ways to increase the demand for knowledge, and especially demand for knowledge related to new and emerging technologies that will help both innovation, but maybe also scaling up in terms of commercialization.
Yes, thank you, Mette. This reminds me of this PDMA study that we have both been working on, where we looked at the impact of COVID-19 on R&D investments, at least by hundreds of respondents. And in a nutshell, what we saw is that many of them have actually lowered their R&D investments, whereas some have continued their R&D investments to be as strong or perhaps even higher than before. And maybe the main takeaway from this research was that it was mostly already high-performing companies that continued to invest in R&D despite the crisis. Poor performers actually lowered their investment in R&D.
Yeah,
you
and
wanted to
if I
say
can
something,
just,
yes?
if I can just add there, Max, I mean, what we see is that the best performers, they also know how to do they have the best practices, so they can increase their performance, both in terms of innovation and growth and all this stuff. But the majority of the small, medium-sized enterprises are in fact not in the best performance. And therefore, these crisis situations will just further increase this need. So how can we, I mean, that's a big question. How can you increase demand for knowledge with companies that think they have enough? For me, that's a big question. And that will, of course, have an impact. So in terms of the panel title, right, that will have an impact in terms of globalization, because when you are not innovative, you're not going out there, you're staying with your local market. So all of this may have these add-on effects where we will see more lower innovation, lower growth, yes, and a bigger divide between innovative and non-innovative firms.
Yeah, thank you. This investment in R&D, investment in new technology, I think Iris addressed that in her statement. She has, by the way, turned off her camera because she's in a low bandwidth area, but she's still with us. So Iris, what you said was that the digitalization, sort of the ongoing digitalization, which means that companies are increasingly technologically competent in using various forms of digital technologies, whether this is just the internet or the many other technologies that come with it, whether this is AI and big data, Internet of Things, and so on. You actually said that this perhaps decreases globalization, or at least it makes cross-border innovation less important and maybe even less relevant. So technology, instead of global presence, instead of being present in the market. Could you elaborate on this a little bit? To what extent do you see this actually be in sort of in contradiction, or perhaps in alignment with some of the trends that we've just been talking about? I find this a really interesting statement. You're muted, just in case you were already talking, Iris. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear me clearly.
It's so.
No.
Now we cannot hear you. Now we can.
Is it better now?
Yes, it's good. Now it's good.
So, sorry, Max, I didn't hear your question, even. Would you please restate your question, just
Yes, no problem at all. No, this will give me hopefully the opportunity to make it more clear. You said that digitalization may actually lead to a reduction.
I'm back.
Yes, Iris, I'm just repeating the question. You said that digitalization may actually lead to a reduction in cross-border innovation, which sounds somewhat counterintuitive because we invest so much in R&D and technologies in order to increase digitalization. So is this sort of a trade-off of technology versus market access, or technology development versus versus further internationalization. Somehow, you know, technology companies tend to be the ones who actually internationalize the most because they need to have access to those technologies, or they use these technologies in order to access faraway markets. Could you elaborate a little bit on the statement of yours?
I think, I maybe didn't clarify clearly just before. So what I mentioned is that, you know, we do see the force of the digitization, and that is actually a force helping with globalization. So, but on the other hand, that is another thing, which is a more deglobalization force that basically, for instance, if you look at, the regulations, right? So there are, healthcare data regulation, for instance. So a lot of, data privacy issues. So a lot of countries make it hard for data to transfer across national borders. And that made, not to say big companies, even just startups, when they try to utilize data to help train, for instance, the AI models, right, which heavily rely on data, and make it hard because of these, national regulations. So that make deglobalization happening. But yes, you're right. When we talk about digitization, and which makes a lot of processes easier for companies, to transfer their technology assets, intellectual properties. So that is helping the globalization. Still we see that in many IT sectors, in biotech, so all these are still happening. But it's really the regulation part. So, and also, the recent crisis in the semiconductor supply chain, and when you see that happening, a lot of countries and started to set up very restrictive national policies regarding what R&D, what part of innovation, you are allowed to be put in another countries. So that's the two forces. Basically, I see that going to either direction. And of course, there is also if you look at talents, for instance, hiring, right? So because because of COVID, because of people will move around, and because of digitization, so make it easier for a company to hire a remote. So that makes it easier. The globalization is still going on. So that's why I'm seeing that, when you ask this question, deglobalization of innovation, I do see these forces coming from both directions, can go either help with globalization or deglobalization. And at any point of time, it might be a balance issue, right? So what maybe certain sectors, so you'll see that easily more globalized than others, or certain sectors will become more deglobalized in a sense.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you for this precision. We have about 5 minutes left on this panel, and we have a question from the audience, from Monica, another Monica, not you, Monica Petraito, who raises the question here, and I'm just reading it off here in the chat. How does COVID-19 change these tendency of globalization, of deglobalization? Did it make it stronger? Did it make it perhaps weaker? But basically, what is the impact of COVID-19 on the trends of deglobalization? Does anybody have a point on that?
Yeah, just to oh, sorry. Could you hear me?
We can hear you, Iris. Yes. Iris, why don't you take the lead, and Monica, please follow up.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry to jump forward. Yeah, because I just mentioned, regarding COVID-19, I do see that COVID-19 helped with globalization still, in big sense. One is on, regarding talents, how companies really able to hire people work remotely, right, these days, because it's just a lot of companies, like in Silicon Valley, so they are allowing the employees to work in different places. And even we see engineers, work in Hawaii, for instance, in other places where they desire, and then they can still show some good productivity. So that makes the managers pretty happy still. So that is COVID-19 in a sense actually helps the globalization still going very strong. And of course, you see in other sense, because of COVID-19 previously, if you look at healthcare, in terms of public health data, personal health data, so all have been in a very restrictive zone. And because of COVID-19, so there are various forces to trying to push sharing of, the data. So that make it easier, for some globalized research, for companies, so be able to share their assets, data assets or other assets, IPs, to help innovate. So if we look at, companies, like Pfizer, Moderna, so they still trying their best to, give, to share their knowledge with other places. But of course, there are many restrictions. But anyways, okay, so yeah, I just stop here and leave time for others. Thank you.
Yeah, if I may follow up what Iris just looked from the perspective of large global innovators, I would rather look a little bit commented. It's not only COVID. I think we are experiencing over last 3 years like a dramatic drops or distractions in the supply chain and cut-offs, and they were many over the last 3 to 4 years. Of COVID was one thing. Now we have war. Now we are facing like nearly global hunger if the exports of crops will not move from Ukraine on timely basis. And this forced innovators to become more pragmatic, and companies are innovating much more about, let's say, so building resilience and sustainability within regional supply chains. I wouldn't call a local supply chain. It's not possible. We cannot go back. But actually, regional innovation, geographical proximity, also security and safety issues, and navigating old known, like established processes, rethinking them because they just do not work for the global conditions as we face them. And I see a lot of innovation going around the supply chain, and rethinking and digitalization of supply chain is also a very important issue. Innovating at each step of supply chain, not only with the new products, new solutions, but also at their delivery of value to where it needs to be delivered, becomes a new challenge, like well forgotten, but new challenge for companies, for entire supply chains. So I think it's one very important thing that we need to look at. And then also value added across those reduced supply chains. In some way they got reduced, they were cut off, they were more regionalized. Then it becomes that innovating across those value chains becomes also more regional. And most of the knowledge that can solve those problems, they are not in R&D centers. This knowledge is with the consumer, with the customer, with the local communities that somehow navigate. And let's say the notion of frugal innovation in a way now can be rethought and brings us back to some kind of local or regional innovation. How do we solve this challenge now? And there is a little bit less of long-term thinking and a little bit more of like this survival-driven, adaptation-driven thinking, at least what we face here in the region. And I believe that many other regions have similar problems because supply chains, they were disrupted all over the world. It's not one region, not Europe only, not Northern, not Eastern Europe. It's all over what we are facing here. So thank you.
Thank you, Monica. We're getting really close to the end of this panel, but just wanted to make it possible, perhaps for Mette, if you have some final points, a final statement, just to wrap it up before I close the panel.
Just that I think what is different about COVID, just to comment on that, is that some industries experienced a really rapid and very big growth in demand, whereas others totally lost their market in matter of few weeks. So I think it's difficult to generalize exactly on the implication of COVID, because it's very much industry dependent. And as you said, Monica, it's clearly the same across the globe, but the differences will be in different industries. So I think we still have a lot to learn about the implications of these changes in the industry structure, and therefore in the value chain compositions in the year to come. So I think there are definitely opportunities that some firms have grabbed, but what exactly their learnings are, I think it's too soon to say.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mette, and in fact, thank you very much everybody on this panel. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Iris, as well. We will have to close here to be on time. Our conference organizers appreciate this being on time, so they can move over to the next panel or the next event. SciBiz, thank you very much for hosting us, and Professor Moisir, thank you very much for inviting us. Thank you very much for all the attendees and the audience. Some of us have shared their questions. We really very much appreciate those. This is what makes this panel lively and worthwhile. And we're signing off here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Max.